Thanks for joining us today. We're hopeful that you're in the right forum. This is a contemporary military forum entitled Multi-Domain Threats in the Future Operating Environment. AUSA, as your professional association, and the Institute of Land Warfare are proud to provide forums like this throughout the year to broaden the knowledge base for not only Army professionals, but for those who support the Army. These professional seminars are AUSA's way of amplifying the U.S. Army's narrative to audiences both inside the Army and to help further the association's mission in support of the voice of the Army and support for the soldier. Of course, we can't do this alone. On your seats, we have a paid advertisement. And the paid advertisement is that if you're not a member of AUSA, please consider joining. And if you are, thank you for your support. But if you're not, it's pretty easy. And so all you have to do is go down to booth 307 in Exhibition Hall A, and they can help you out. Or if you're too intimidated to do that, you can do it online as well. I think that you're going to see a great group of experts here today, and we thank you for participating and being part of this forum. We thank them for their presentations. And without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Brigadier General Kevin Wulfhorst, the Deputy Chief of Staff, G2 for Reserve Affairs. General, over to you.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you for AUSA's continued support of our Army and for your kind remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to today's Contemporary Military Forum number 2, Multi-Domain Threats in the Future Operating Environment. It is my distinct honor to moderate this distinguished panel of experts who will collectively touch upon a very timely topic, the current and future threats facing our expeditionary Army. Whether it be from nation-state great powers like China and Russia, or from pariah states like Iran and North Korea, the nation expects and relies upon the Army to adapt and contend with these challenges. The Chief of Staff of the Army has defined our most pressing threats within the Defense Department's 4+1 threat construct, and has specifically identified Russia as the most pressing near-term threat, as well as the pacing threat for the U.S. Army. He's further identified China as the most dangerous mid to far-term threat. Both of these great power competitors have invested heavily in anti-access area denial capabilities to compensate for their own perceived military weaknesses against the United States. Further, both have demonstrated a desire and capacity to challenge the United States in their respective regions, and both have significant nuclear capacity. Iran and North Korea continue to pose significant hybrid challenges to the U.S. military due to their extensive asymmetric capabilities, both with extensive ballistic missile inventories and, in the case of North Korea, a growing and increasingly threatening ICBM and nuclear capability. Today's panel discussion will address an array of threats from each of these antagonists, as well as the threat from state-orchestrated information operations and malign influence, as it is most noticeably being practiced today by the Russian Federation. These are all timely and relevant topics of concern, so I'm certain having panelists who have served both inside and outside government offers us all a unique and valuable perspective and contributes to a better understanding of the challenges facing us now and in the future. But before I continue any further, I'd like to thank each one of our panelists who've given their own time on a Monday holiday, no less, and graciously joined us today because of their genuine interest in our nation's security and in the future of our Army. This is extremely generous of each of you. On behalf of our gracious hosts, AUSA, and the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Mark Milley, let me thank you. I also want to acknowledge and thank the entire AUSA team of professionals for once again putting on a tremendous annual meeting, highlighting that the Army is indeed the strength of our nation. This panel represents the nation's most experienced and knowledgeable analysts and policy experts, and today they will address issues that vex and oftentimes confound us. They will both challenge and confirm our own thinking, and we hope above all they will lay the foundation for us to conceptualize solutions to these issues and to ultimately succeed on the next battlefield. So I anticipate a spirited panel discussion today and an even better question and answer session, and I hope that each of you will learn from the conversation, and then as you return to your own organizations, think about how the Army, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, the nation writ large, and our allies and partners might contend with these threats now and into the foreseeable future. So to get started, let me introduce our superb panelists. In your handouts, you have detailed biographies of each of our 4 panelists. They come to us from very senior positions in the nation's most distinguished private policy centers. And of course, with their experiences and their credentials, if I did take time to read all of that biographies, we would not have time to actually have a panel discussion. So please take the time to read in detail, but I would like to at least provide a short overview. First, let me welcome Dr. Jeffrey Mankoff, the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before coming to CSIS, he served as an advisor on U.S.-Russia relations at the U.S. Department of State as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow. And from 2008 to 2010, he was Associate Director of International Security Studies at Yale University. Next, and a returning panelist, let me introduce the Director of International Affairs Group for CNA, Mr. Ken Gause. He is CNA's Senior Foreign Leadership Analyst, and he has personally directed studies on North Korean, Iranian, and Russian leadership and decision-making. His work on foreign leadership dates back to the early 1980s with his work on the Soviet Union for the U.S. government. Sitting next to Mr. Gause is a returning panelist from last year's forum. From the Heritage Foundation, a senior fellow for national security affairs, Dr. Peter Brooks. Dr. Brooks is in his fifth term as a congressionally appointed member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Before joining Heritage in 2002, Brooks served in the administration of President George W. Bush as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs, and he's also a Navy veteran. And finally, a research scientist and the Director for Strategy and Partnerships for the Center for Strategic Studies at CNA, Ms. Vera Zakum, who currently leads CNA's work in assessing internal vulnerabilities in vulnerable populations, Europe and Russia, joint civil affairs, and media and influence. She has collaborated with special operations forces, multinational organizations, and other U.S. government agencies in analyzing and assessing human security and taught adversary, futures analytics, and red teaming at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. And finally, I know we have many guests from our allies and partners, but I do want to point out one noted guest in particular, and that is Major General Hulko, sitting in the front row, who is the commander of the Finnish Army. Thank you for joining us today. During the course of the panelists' remarks, members of the audience, you'll have the opportunity to write questions on 3x5 cards, which will be handed out and then collected by our staff, and then selection questions will be posed to our guests at the conclusion of all the remarks. And so without further ado, Dr. Mankoff, we'll begin with you.
Okay, thank you very much, General. Thanks to AUCA and to all of you for being here today. I guess it's not a holiday for you guys. I was a little bit struggling when I was asked to present on this panel exactly how to do that, because I'm not somebody who studies military doctrine or operations. I much more focus on politics and diplomacy. So I thought I could probably provide the most value on this panel, especially given my distinguished co-panelists' expertise, by providing a little bit of a framework for discussing the Russian challenge, one that's going to look less at specifically what Russia is doing and more at why it happens to be doing those things. I think it's become clear, as General Wulfhorst pointed out, that Russia has become a strategic rival of the United States and of the West more broadly. In that context, it's essentially a revisionist power vis-a-vis the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe and the transatlantic space, if not more broadly than that. Where does this come from? Why are we dealing with this challenge today? That really is the question that I want to spend the next 10 or so minutes talking about. And I want to do it by trying to get inside the Russian official mind, if you will, because I think we disregard their own narrative, the stories they tell about themselves and about the current world at our peril. If you listen to how Russian analysts and leaders talk about the current strategic environment, they point to the continued bifurcation of the European security space. That's to say that at the end of the Cold War, the problem of European security was not resolved. If we set ourselves the task of creating a Europe that was whole, free, and at peace, in a zone of peace and stability stretching, as we put it at the time, from Vancouver to Vladivostok, that obviously is not what happened. Sometimes you hear the comparison between 1919 and 1945. In both cases, a coalition of the liberal democratic powers defeated a revisionist rival in Germany. In 1945, that rival, having been defeated, was politically transformed and was, at least its western half, engaged and integrated into the emerging Western security architecture. In 1919, by contrast, Germany was treated as a defeated power that was forced to pay reparations, that suffered the partial occupation of its territory and the loss of populations and resources. After 1919, of course, Germany becomes a serious revisionist power, culminating in the challenge to global order that it posed during the Second World War. Whereas in 1945, nothing of the sort happened. Many Russians would argue that the model that we followed with Russia at the end of the Cold War was much closer to 1919 than it was to 1945. That despite the rhetoric of partnership, institutional apparatuses that were created for the Cold War, first and foremost NATO, continued to exist, continued to operate on the basis of a containment approach to Russia, and Russia itself was left on the outside looking in. There was no Marshall Plan. Russia received some amount of Western assistance and lots of Western advice, but instead of a transformation towards a liberal, democratic, flourishing democracy, Russia in the 1990s became a chaotic kleptocracy with a declining standard of living, increased insecurity for both institutions and individuals, and an overall decline in the status from being one of two superpowers to being a fairly peripheral actor on the European stage. In response, over the course of the last 25 plus years, Russia has, in a variety of ways, sought to challenge that settlement to, as it were, find a place for itself in this post-Cold War order, one that it argues it did not have a hand in creating. Now, that challenge has existed ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It became worse in some ways in the late 1990s, and then there was a period of improvement of relations in the early 2000s following the 9/11 attacks and the onset of cooperation between the US and Russia in the war against the Taliban. More recently, though, beginning perhaps in 2008, perhaps a little bit later, things have gone in a much different direction. And I would argue that that is for a couple of different reasons. One is a Russian perception of Western decline. Ever since the financial crisis in the United States and Europe, there has been a clear sense in Moscow that the West is on its heels, that it's more focused on getting its own house in order, that its aspirations to global leadership and to spreading its own model globally have hit the skids, and that that's no longer a realistic aspiration. The world is now entering a more multipolar global order, one in which Russia itself seeks to play the role of one of the poles, one of the key pillars of whatever is going to emerge in this post-Western world. And of course, Russia is based on a series of ideas and principles about politics, global order, and legitimacy that are in many ways different from the ones that we in the West cling to. Moreover, Russia believes that the West has been engaged in a long-running campaign to subvert and ultimately overthrow its own government, in part out of a rejection of the legitimacy of the political model that emerged in Russia in the post-Cold War period. This has become particularly true in recent years, particularly since Vladimir Putin returned to the Kremlin in 2012, following a series of contested elections and the emergence of large protest movements in Moscow and other Russian cities. At the time, Putin and his allies charged that the United States and its allies were funding the demonstrators that they were ultimately seeking to subvert and ultimately overthrow the Russian government. Of course, this manifestation was followed just a year or two later by the outbreak of serious protests and ultimately a real revolution in Ukraine. And the notion in Russia was that if the Maidan could happen in Ukraine, something that the West was clearly supporting in the Russian view, then why not in Russia itself? And so in thinking about why Russia decided to deploy military forces to Ukraine, I think there's a very strong domestic political component, a desire to make sure that the revolutionary changes that have taken place in Ukraine since 2013, 2014 do not spread to Russia, and that ultimately they fail in Ukraine as well, making clear that Ukraine does not have the option of becoming a liberal Western democratic country, so that Russians don't get any ideas. Of course, there's a longstanding belief in Russia that Russians and Ukrainians are, as Vladimir Putin has put it, one people, and that what goes for Ukrainians ultimately goes for Russians as well. Now, moreover, this isn't just about Russia. Russians, looking at the way that the United States has behaved globally over the last 2 decades, would argue that instead of spreading democracy, prosperity, and peace, the United States and the West have instead succeeded in unleashing chaos, whether it was with the invasion of Iraq, which of course prompted an insurgency and eventually led to the formation of the Islamic State, its support for the political change in the context of the Arab Spring, which had a similar result, or indeed in Ukraine itself, where the Russian narrative is that instead of democratizing, the U.S. has empowered the far right, has empowered Ukrainian nationalists, and has destroyed the pillars of Ukrainian statehood. The most notable example of this that Russians talk about, and the one that I think has the most personal resonance for Vladimir Putin, is Libya, where Russia, of course, supported the United States, at least to the extent of abstaining on a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force to protect Libyan civilians against the forces of Muammar Gaddafi. But in the Russian view, the United States overinterpreted the mandate that it received from the Security Council, provided air cover for an effort to ultimately unseat and murder Gaddafi that led to the complete collapse of Libyan statehood, the spread of terrorism, instability, and jihadism outside of Libya into the broader Middle East, and in a way that threatens both Russia and the United States themselves. As I heard one high-ranking Russian official put it once, what did you like better? Previously, you had Gaddafi and American ambassadors were not getting killed in Libya. Now you don't have Gaddafi and American ambassadors are getting killed in Libya. When were you better off? I'm not recounting this argument in order to endorse it, but in order to give you a sense of how the Russian narrative views the way that the United States has acted and why this response has justified, in their mind, Russia doing the things that it's done. There's a process of mirroring here going on that I think is very important. And this gets to the way that Russia operates, too. I'm sure the name Valery Gerasimov is going to come up at some point in the conversation today. The chief of the Russian General Staff, who's sometimes credited or charged with crafting a doctrine of nonlinear or hybrid warfare. It's sometimes referred to as the Gerasimov doctrine. If you actually read Gerasimov's writings, though, about the use of non-kinetic, non-traditional forms of power projection, what he's really saying is that these are the things that the West has done already, including in Ukraine. The mobilizing of civil society, the funding of groups seeking to promote political change, support for political parties, manipulation of information, and that it's doing these things to pursue a discrete political goal. And that if Russia doesn't adapt, if Russia doesn't learn how to do these things that the West is already engaged in, it's going to fall behind. And so the emergence of Russia's efforts at destabilization, whether it's in the United States, it's in Europe, it's in its post-Soviet neighbors, owes very much to this mirroring, to this perception that these are things that the West and the United States in particular have been engaged in for a very long time. So it's easy for us sitting here sometimes, I think, to say that Russia is just a bad actor, that Putin is evil, that Russia is seeking to sow chaos for the sake of sowing chaos. And I think from our perspective, there is some truth to that. But at the same time, I think it's important to understand that the Russians have a story too, and that their narrative about how the world works, how the United States has behaved, and why the existing international system has been detrimental to their own interests helps us better understand what they're trying to do, and I think ultimately helps us better figure out what we're going to do about it if we do, in fact, want to preserve the system that we've inherited from the end of the Cold War. So let me stop there and pass the floor over to my colleagues.
All righty. Thank you for coming today. I think this is a very interesting topic about the 4+1 and what that means for us in the future. And with North Korea, I think we're looking at something that I think is evolving and can become potentially very dangerous very quickly, but not for the reasons that a lot of the people in this room are probably thinking about. Next slide. If you want to understand anything about North Korea, you can't start at the 70,000-foot level. Trying to understand North Korea at the strategic level is going to lead you down a lot of rabbit holes and a lot of strategic miscalculations about what North Korea is up to. You have to get down to the very personal level, because inside North Korea, it's all about politics of the individuals. And regime dynamics are centered on Kim Jong-un and his key lieutenants, most of whom come from a web of around 51 families inside North Korea. This is evolving. Even as of yesterday, we had the second plenum of the seven-party Congress, in which we saw a lot of new people come into the Politburo, the Central Military Commission, and a lot of other key party bodies, including Kim Jong-un's younger sister, Kim Yo-chong, who is a very young but up-and-coming person worth watching inside North Korea. And in order to understand everything I'm going to tell you in this brief here, you need to understand and keep in mind it's all about the Kim family and his key lieutenants. Kim Jong-un runs his regime very differently than his father and grandfather did. His father and grandfather ran the regime primarily off of martial law and Juche philosophy. Basically, the idea that North Korea could basically pull itself up by its own bootstraps. Kim Jong-un has elements of those two things inside of it, but it also, Kim Jong-un is much more wedded to policy success inside North Korea than his father and grandfather is. And if he does not show progress on policies, economic policy, policy for the nuclear program, so forth, he will take a hit in terms of the legitimacy. And so finally, when we give a lot of attention to the nuclear program, but in Kim's mind, there is a ticking bomb inside North Korea right now, and it's tied to the economy. And even the nuclear program is in service in some way to what he has planned for the economy inside North Korea. There's a growing moneyed elite inside North Korea called the Donju. And these are people that are children of the elite. They're people that run a variety of illicit and licit foreign hard currency operations. These are the people that right now are being taxed a lot because of the sanctions that are going on top of North Korea. They have growing expectations, and they're looking to Kim to satisfy those great expectations. And over the next few years, and if he's not able to do this, he's going to have a problem. Next slide. So what is his grand strategy? If Kim Jong-un is the ultimate decision maker, which we believe he is, we believe that he has finally consolidated his power, and he's somebody who's under pressure to show and prove, the question becomes, what does he want? What drives his decision making? What is his end game? And this can be summed up by two strategic goals. And when we think about North Korea and we think about whatever Kim wants to do, decision-making on economic reform, decision-making on the nuclear deterrent, decision-making on whether to retaliate to U.S. strikes inside North Korea if we were to do that, it all comes down to two things: regime survival and, more importantly, perpetuation of the Kim family rule. He will not take any decision that does not factor in these two objectives. In support of these objectives, Kim has a strategy of brinksmanship designed to weaken and ultimately change the current status quo in the region, the status quo which is basically mandated by the United States, South Korea, and its allies. North Korea is trying to become an accepted nuclear state to the nuclear family of states, and it wants to engage the outside world as a nuclear power. In support of these objectives, as I said, he does the variety of brinksmanship going up and down the escalatory ladder. So if we ask ourselves how North Korea will react in a period of growing tension with the United States, I think the answer will be that it will react rationally and in the service of these two objectives. If you try to explain North Korea as acting as a rational state for its own people and what's good for its people, you're completely missing the boat here. It's what's good for the Kim family and the cohort of leaders that surround him. And they will not likely attack unless provoked. And if the U.S. attacks North Korea, then it gets into a much more complicated decision-making process, something that we can talk about in the Q&A if you want to. Next slide. So in order to understand Kim's calculus, it makes sense to put it into context. A month ago or so, in the Wall Street Journal, Secretaries Tillerson and Mattis wrote an op-ed in which they said, North Korea now faces a choice. Take a new path toward peace and prosperity and international acceptance, or continue down the dead alley of belligerence, poverty, and isolation. This is how the United States and its allies see Kim's choice. It's not how Kim Jong-un sees his own choice. So how does Kim see his own future and the future of his country? He operates off of script that dates back to the beginning of the regime. He assesses risk and settles doctrines and strategies that fall within acceptable outcomes. These outcomes stretch back to the beginning of the regime and act as the brackets within which North Korean strategy and policy operate. Basically, survival of the regime as being the minimum goal, and completion of the revolution being the desired goal. But it is something that, well, next slide. If we look at strategies that North Korea employs, political strategies, military strategies, economic strategies, the closer you get to the minimum goal, the more defensive in nature these strategies tend to be. The more you get closer to the desired goal of completion of the revolution, which would be reunification under North Korea, the more offensive these strategies get. So, next slide. Some of the discussions coming out of the U.S. and Western sources these days highlights outcomes that are totally unacceptable to Kim Jong-un and the regime. Unacceptable outcomes are assessed as no longer guaranteeing regime survival. Essentially, any outcome that does not take into account the perpetuation of Kim family rule is unacceptable. So when we talk about, well, we want to negotiate with Kim and we want to negotiate with North Korea if they will just give up their nuclear program, well, North Korea just laughs at that. There's no way they're going to give up their nuclear weapons because it is in service of these two primary goals. It ensures the minimum, which is survival of the regime. They look at what happened in Libya to Gaddafi. They look at what happened in Iraq to Saddam. These are countries that gave up their nuclear programs or their nascent nuclear programs, and look what happened to them. North Korea is not going to make the same mistake, not in their eyes. And so they're going to continue to manipulate the escalatory ladder, hopefully not step over any red lines from their perspective, and continue to move along toward getting their nuclear program. The question is whether we will allow, whether there are new red lines in play in the region in which North Korea may accidentally step over. That is something the North Koreans right now are trying to figure out. They don't really understand the U.S. red lines anymore. They thought they knew what they were. They predicted that Hillary Clinton would be elected president. They had a game plan, and now they have President Trump, and they are struggling to try to figure out how that works. Next slide. So, when we look at the history of North Korean military doctrine and strategy, over the last 70 years, we see a fluctuation between the regime's assessed outcomes and associated offensive and defensive nature of its approaches. These strategies represent phases. The trend line, that black line that's probably very hard to see on there, or at least it is for me over here, measures the offensive nature of North Korean military strategy and doctrine as it tracks from 1945 to 2017. You could see the spike in the early 1950s to accommodate the Korean War when North Korea tried to achieve their desired goal of reunification through force. And then you see this big drop-off. And this starts to tell us how North Korea operates. When North Korea has internal dissension of any kind, you will see that they will basically go turtle. They will go and they will hide, and their strategies become very defensive. So what happened at the end of the Korean War? You had Kim Il-sung starting to consolidate his power. He was fighting the elements of the regime that were tied to the Soviet Union and China. He also the country was basically economically recovering from the war. So you had the drop-off. Until the early 1960s, and then they had a major reformation of North Korean military doctrine, the so-called Four Guidelines, in which they introduced lessons learned from the Korean War as well as the Vietnam experience to bring an unconventional element into North Korean military doctrine. And so they became, in the 1960s, a combination of conventional and unconventional doctrine in North Korea. And we started to see a spike in the offensive nature of their strategies and doctrine with periodic attacks against the South. Leading in 1968, you had the attack on the Blue House, you had the capturing of the Pueblo, you had the shooting down of the U.S. intelligence plane. Yeah, and so what happens after that? All of a sudden, you have a drop-off again in their doctrine, back toward the defensive nature. What happened? Well, in the early 1970s, Kim started to prepare his succession, even though it was in the 70s and he didn't die until the 1990s. And you had Kim Jong-il become the heir apparent. You had the new Constitution come out in 1972, which really kind of announced to the world the beginning of the Kim Il-sung era as he had fully consolidated his power. And then you had basically the regime going through a period of consolidation inside. So you had a period of this kind of very defensive nature in its doctrine until the 1980s. And then all of again, suddenly we start to see a spike again. And why do we see a spike? Because whenever you create an heir apparent in a totalitarian regime, they got to start to stretch their wings in terms of trying to play the escalatory ladder. So we had a variety of different terrorist strikes and the blowing up of the Korean airliner, as well as the bombings in Rangoon, targeted assassinations that were going on. And this lasts basically up until the late 1980s, where you had North Korea put on the terrorism watch list, and to the early 1990s. What happened there? Basically, at this point, we know because of the East German archives that Kim Il-sung was telling Erich Honecker, who at the time was the head of the Communist Party in East Germany, that the North Korea no longer saw the ability to win a war conventionally on the peninsula. They could not reunify by war. And so this is where we started to see a program that really has its roots back in the 1950s. Basically, the nuclear program really comes to fore and begins to accelerate. And this is basically an asymmetric approach, a way of guaranteeing regime survival, not necessarily regime or reunification on the peninsula. They need to have the deterrent. And as we look at this, we see this precipitous drop in basically their offensive elements of their doctrine, even though they do continue to do provocations and brinksmanship, such as the sinking of the Chenan and so on and so forth. But it's all in defense of the regime more so than as an offensive element to their doctrine. But now we're coming to the point where North Korea, in a few years, may have a viable nuclear deterrent. And the question is, how is that going to affect their doctrine? Are they going to then use it as a coercive element to try to push the U.S. off the peninsula and reunify under North Korea? Or are they going to basically engage the outside world as a normal nuclear power? We don't know yet. So we're kind of waiting to see how this all plays out. Next. So when we look at in more recent period, the brinksmanship under Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, we see that Kim Jong-un conducts brinksmanship and provocation in a very different way than his father did. His father used brinksmanship or used the nuclear program basically as a bargaining chip to try to set the stage for negotiations for economic aid from the outside world. And so you saw these periodic strikes and kinetic activity, especially out around the NLL, the Northern Limit Line, in the maritime environment. But when you get to Kim Jong-un, we see something very, very different. With the exception of what happened in 2015, which was the attack on the DMZ, his provocations basically have been testing the critical defense systems, the missile system and the nuclear program. He has now put this thing on an honest-to-God program with milestones that did not exist under his father. It is a very calculated, step-by-step process in order to eventually reach a viable nuclear deterrent that can strike the United States, because it is only that will keep the United States from eventually overthrowing his regime from his point of view. Next. This shows a little bit more in specificity about really, this constant drumbeat of their testing of their defense systems, with the notable exception of the DMZ attack in 2015, which was designed to try to re-engage South Korea. It didn't work. South Korea stuck to their guns about denuclearization, and North Korea basically tanked the talks and really went hell for leather beginning in January of 2016, when they tested the fourth nuclear test, followed by numerous missile tests, and through on, up until last month. Next. So what can we do? Can we deter North Korea? I would argue that you can't deter them at the lower end of the escalatory ladder. They've already built into their calculus what they think that we're going to do in response to their tests. The further you go up the escalatory ladder, especially when you're talking about deaths primarily of civilians, but also military deaths, such as the Chenan, that's where it gets a little bit more problematic for North Korea. So the further you go up into the kinetic provocations is the point in which North Korea can be deterred. The further you go, because again, we're talking about regime survival and perpetuation of the Kim family regime. They're not going to do anything that is going to put those things at risk. Then you have this period that they can be deterred. And then you go up further the escalatory ladder, and it gets really squirrely, because this is where they have to kind of figure out whether, and we would see this maybe in the midst of a conflict or a real crisis, where they're trying to make the decision on whether the jig is up or whether they can find a way out. If they can find a way out, they'll be deterred. If, on the other hand, they believe that the jig is up, that the regime is headed toward collapse, then the ability to deter becomes very, very difficult. And that's probably where we're looking at nuclear exchange. Next slide. This is the last slide. So what keeps us up at night, the people that watch North Korea, or at least people like me that watch North Korea, is basically, what could happen to this regime if Kim dies tomorrow? Kim Jong-un is not in very good health. He has a lot of physical ailments. He probably has health ailments. We know he has kidney and liver problems. He has a body mass index, we believe, of somewhere around 40, which is in stroke territory. He smokes, he drinks, he doesn't eat right, he doesn't get any exercise as far as we know. But everything in that regime comes together at him. He's the linchpin. And if all of a sudden he drops dead tomorrow, you do not have a viable continuance of governance plan. They have a continuance of governance plan, but it's based on a collective leadership model, which will not hold together. Most likely it would be his older brother, Kim Jong-chol, who would be put out there as a figurehead, and he would be in front of a lot of very powerful figures, many of whom have their own equities and are basically in competition with each other behind the scenes. That could lead to a collapse of the regime. If you have the collapse of the regime, it is not going to stay contained in North Korea. It will flood over into China. It will potentially have strikes on South Korea. You have the frontline corps, especially the 2nd and the 5th Corps, which are on a hairline trigger. And if command and control in Pyongyang goes, the possibility of artillery strikes into Seoul is a very real possibility. So this gets a very dangerous, and also we don't have one center of gravity that we can negotiate with for a termination of conflict. We possibly have multiple centers of gravity, which makes this a very, very difficult situation. And we need to understand that the more pressure we put on this regime, the possibility of something like this happening. So we could end up getting, you get a lot of these stories, well, we need to take the Kim family down, and we need to strangle the Kim family and the strangulation campaign. You may be you need to be really careful what you wish for, because this can get a lot worse very quick. Thank you.
Dr. Brooks, before you begin, I just want to remind all the members of the audience there are 3x5 cards, so if you do have questions, please write those down, and then at the end of the panel presentations, we will take questions from the audience. When you write the card, members of our staff will collect them.
I think I've got a slide to start the presentation. Oops. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much, General. It's a pleasure to be here again. I guess a surprise. You could certainly put this in the category of the triumph of hope over experience, having me back. Plus, being a Navy guy, that's another strike against me. But my son is an Army captain, so maybe that helped. We're generationally improving the gene pool in the Brooks family. Anyway, if we get my slide up, I'm going to talk about China, the strategic challenge of China, and it may be actually kind of cheery compared to Ken's presentation, which is not, considering all the topics we're talking about today. It's that's kind of hard. That's kind of hard to come by. So I'm going to talk about the People's Republic of China. There's a beautiful picture of the Great Wall. And I'll talk about the strategic challenges and some of the flashpoints that we may face as armed services, including the Army in particular. And I also would, in a shameless moment of self-promotion or for the Heritage Foundation, have you check out our new book, which is available here in booth 1169, also online. It's called the 2018 Index of U.S. Military Strength, which assesses the global operating environment as well as U.S. military strength to operate in that environment. In my view, China is going to be our biggest strategic challenge in this century. In fact, I think beyond the United States, no country will shape the 21st century more, for good or bad, than China. This is a nation that is characterized by an increasing number of superlatives and near superlatives. We're talking about a country with the largest population in the world today, the #2 economy behind the United States, having surpassed Japan, #2 in defense spending. It's difficult to come up with exact numbers in terms of their defense spending, but it continues to grow. Some say, in fact, I think there's like a cottage industry out there trying to figure out exactly how much China is spending on defense because of the inconvertibility of its currency and just the lack of transparency in terms of the Chinese budget. But we're talking about I think over the last 20 years, an average of double digits, more than 10% in terms of defense and spending increases. This year, it's going to be 8 or so percent. But once again, that doesn't give us a full sense because some of the things are actually off budget in the Chinese budget. They're number one consumer of energy, number one producer of greenhouse gases, number one consumer of commodities in the world today. And at one point, China was consuming more coal than the rest of the world combined. Now they're making moves because of environmental degradation, but this gives you a sense of what we're really dealing with. And of course, not all of these attributes are good for the United States, especially defense spending. So what does China currently want? I mean, I think it really wants to return China to a position of great power status. For years, we don't hear this as much anymore. China talked about 150 years of humiliation at the hands of outside powers. I mean, this goes back to the opening wars back in the 1840s. Especially over things like Hong Kong and the concessions that were given to other countries. President Xi calls this the China dream, the rejuvenation of the Chinese people, of the Chinese state, a national restoration. Another important issue for China is to protect and defend Chinese sovereignty, its core interests, which are a little bit fluid. Certainly things like Taiwan are a core interest. South China Sea seems to move in and out of the issue of core interests. Certainly its sovereignty issues, its territorial integrity are considered to be core interests. Also, as Ken mentioned, for the Chinese Communist Party, it's the survival of the regime. I mean, this is job number one. China is not a democracy. It's an authoritarian state, and for them, their legitimacy is critical to them as well as their survival. So in many ways, that's kind of job one. They want to develop the political, economic, military, and informational power. Basically, it's comprehensive national power to shape the international environment in China's favor. China sees this period now as a strategic window of opportunity for doing that. I think it also wants to replace the United States as the predominant power in the Pacific, in Asia, and I think ultimately globally. China wants to sit as the middle kingdom atop the international system. Slide change, please. This is a Chinese military parade in Tiananmen Square. And I think the most interesting thing about this is if you notice on the side of that Chinese missile there, that missile launcher is DF-21D, which is in English, probably for a foreign audience to notice. And of course, this is the Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile, a unique weapon system that is also called the carrier killer. And they're talking about the U.S. carrier in that respect. But I mean, to support these ambitions that I just talked about, the Chinese political ambitions, its global ambitions, the PRC is involved in a major military buildup. And it's commensurate with its great power vision. If they ask, well, China, you're not threatened by anybody, why are you building up your military? They will say, well, this is something that great powers have. They have great militaries. They have great political power. They have great economic power, and they have great militaries. This military is meant to deter, delay, or deny an enemy from threatening its interests, including what people are calling now an A2AD strategy, or an anti-access area denial strategy. They're involved in a significant investment in the defense industrial base. China is serious about this. They're increasingly capable in terms of their defense industrial base, not only through research and development, but also through theft, which many of you have heard about. And they're trying to produce top-notch defense systems. They're making progress in that regard. And the other thing is that the military and the civilian sectors are working hand in hand because of the way the economy is state-driven in China. So if the commercial sector is benefiting, then the military, if there's a military application, will benefit as well. They're also involved in the professionalization of their armed forces. China has the world's largest army, as you know. The army and the party are one, as you'll hear politically from Chinese leaders. But they're downsizing it. They're reducing the size of it, but they're professionalizing it. In fact, one of the most significant things that they're doing is they're developing an NCO Corps, which, as we all know, is the basis of a modern, professional, top-notch military. They're also involved in combat and joint warfare training. They're moving away from single services to joint warfare, which is critical to them. It's developing its power projection forces. This is one of the focuses of their military. The Navy is now a blue water Navy. There's an interesting story going back to the days of Mao, when it took Mao like 3 years to actually visit the small Chinese Navy after they won the Civil War in 1949. It wasn't that important. Today it is very much important. China is building aircraft carriers. They have one at sea. It's considered to be operational. They're building more of them. They have the largest navy in Asia today. They have the world's most prodigious shipbuilding program. That includes warships. In terms of its air force, we're talking about fourth and fifth generation fighters, stealth fighters, bombers, largest air force in Asia. Now, I'm not including the United States when I say in Asia in that respect, even though we are certainly a Pacific nation. Number 3 in the world in terms of air force. And it's getting increasingly better. Large numbers in the past. Now they're moving towards more capable modern aircraft. They're also talking about expeditionary capabilities beyond China, to operate beyond China's periphery. Their strategic forces is another critical element. I think that China probably has the largest ballistic missile force in the world today. I'm not sure on those numbers, but I'm pretty sure that is the case. I talked about the DF-21 shown there in that picture. There's also the DF-26, which was probably also displayed in the same way in this military parade, which is also known as the Guam Killer or the Guam Express. So this is an intermediate range ballistic missile that can reach Guam and our forces that are located there. In terms of strategic forces, China's into information dominance. They want to be able to win wars in the information age. This includes cyber operations, obviously. If we weren't talking about Russia today for all the reasons that we've been talking about it, for political and other reasons, we'd be talking about China. Incredible amount of American intellectual property has been whisked away via the internet and Chinese cyber operations. Also cyber warfare. They're involved in that. Some people in this audience are probably working on these issues, but I know in the past we were quite confident that both the Russians and the Chinese had mapped the American electrical grid and would probably shut it off if they could do so in times of crisis. They're interested in information dominance. Space, which is something a lot of people don't talk about when they talk about the Chinese military. Chinese are involved in counter space operations. They're putting satellites in space for information purposes. They're also involved in counter satellite operations, which people aren't talking about. That includes direct descent operations as well as co-orbital operations. Everything from dazzling to lasers to kinetic ways of damaging other satellites. The interesting thing for us, the Americans in the room, is the fact that it's believed that China holds all of our satellites at risk, both geosynchronous and every orbital regime that we have, Chinese have access to, low Earth orbit and geosynchronous. In terms of nuclear capabilities, strategic capabilities, one of the things that, as a Navy guy, I noticed is that China has sent its nuclear deterrent to sea, Ward Fleet ballistic missile submarines. Moved away from silo-based missiles. They have road mobile missiles, certainly, and now they're sending it to sea. And there's also talk about the fact that they're developing bombers to complete that triad, and land attack cruise missiles, or I'm sure they have gravity bombs for those bombers already, nuclear gravity bombs. So they're talking about increasing their survivability, their lethality, as well as the penetrability of those nuclear forces. Internationally, they're involved. I mean, who would have thought we'd see Chinese warships operating with the Russians in the Baltic Sea? They operate in the South China Sea. They've operated there with Russia. They've operated in the Med. They're also the number 3 country in the world today in terms of global arms sales, and they're moving up the value chain in terms of their arms sales. So is the Chinese military a 10-foot giant? No, not yet. But it aspires to be the American military. It wants to be as good as the Americans in terms of their military capability. It's a significant military power. It's a significant military power now. So why should the Army care? I mean, what's the so what question? Let me go through a couple of flashpoints here and show you why I think these things are very important to the U.S. Army. Next slide, please. Number 1 issue for the Chinese, this is the Taiwan Strait there, 100 miles between the mainland and Taiwan. China considers this a core interest, which I define as an interest that that Beijing is willing to fight over. This includes independence on the part of Taiwanese. The Chinese want unification. They consider Taiwan to be part of the People's Republic of China. This is a non-negotiable issue. It's building the military capability to bend Taiwan to its will if it needs to. This goes everything from decapitation operations to a bolt from the blue ballistic missile attack, to amphibious landings. They're developing all of these capabilities, and it's still the main focus of their military buildup. And unfortunately, the balance of power across the Taiwan Strait has shifted in the direction of China. Has shifted from Taiwan to China. The Chinese military is more capable now than the Taiwanese military. It's more powerful. Slide, please. Ken just did a great job on North Korea, but I'm going to say a few things because obviously it's something that China cares about a lot. And obviously this is Kim Jong-un with perhaps a model of a thermonuclear weapon. China and U.S. Interests on the Korean Peninsula don't align. People need to understand this. China has concerns, a lot of concerns on the Korean Peninsula. Obviously, geography is destiny, and you can't just pick up and move away. China and the Korean Peninsula are attached. So China has to care what's going on there. China, I think, Beijing is worried about a united Korea that may not be pro-China. Say if there's unification or regime change in the north and there's unification of north and south. There's a lot of history there between China and Korea. They're worried about a pro-U.S. Korea. They have serious concerns seeing U.S. forces Korea above the 38th parallel. I mean, all you have to do is harken back to 1950, right? U.S. forces landed Incheon, chased the North Korean forces back towards the Chinese border, and what happens? 200,000 quote-unquote volunteers come across the border to change the war to where it is today, actually. They're worried about that. They're also worried about instability. China sees this as a period of strategic opportunity. They want quiet. They want to be able to develop their economy. They want access to commodities and energy. They want to deal with their challenges that they face at home in governing 1.3 billion people and raising their standards of living. They really don't want any problems of a nature that, such as they might find as a war on the Korean Peninsula. They're also worried about a civil war, should there be some sort of situation in Pyongyang, where Kim Jong-un is no longer in charge, between the security forces, the party, the military. They don't want to see large refugee flows across the Chinese border. There are already a lot of North Koreans across the border in China. They don't want to worry about that. They want 22 million people moving across the border. And of course, what happens if the regime collapses or there's a war in terms of the nuclear weapons? And of course, China has made its thoughts known on this issue and has tried to deter North Korean provocations many times, quietly, sometimes publicly. One of the ones I like to note is that the Global Times, which is the English language version of a Chinese English language paper, recently had an editorial. Now, I'm not saying this is the official mouthpiece of the Chinese government, but I'd say it's pretty close. They basically said, look, North Korea, if you pick a fight with the Americans, we're going to remain neutral. But they also said, Americans, if you pick a fight with the North Koreans, we're not going to remain neutral. So they certainly have a lot at stake there. I agree with Ken that I don't think that North Korea is going to give up its nuclear weapons. It's certainly a regime or a life insurance policy for them. Next slide, please. This is, don't worry about reading all that stuff. This is a Heritage Foundation product, but this is what's known as the 9-dash line, which is a term that the Chinese aren't using so much anymore, but people know when you talk about the 9-dash line, people know what we're talking about. This basically is what China considers to be Chinese sovereign territory. China claims almost the entirety of the South China Sea as Chinese sovereign territory. They say this is indisputable. This is about 1 million square miles of sea. It incorporates one-half of the world's one-half of global commerce moves through the South China Sea. 1/3 of the trade in oils. Another thing is that 80% of Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan's imported energy needs move through the South China Sea. So the Chinese say that this is our territory based on historic and some geographic claims. The Permanent Court of Arbitration, the Filipinos took the Chinese to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. The Permanent Court of Arbitration looked at it a few years based on the Law of the Sea Treaty and came back and said, China, you have no claims. The Chinese refused to participate in the case, and they've basically ignored that. And as you know, they've built 7 artificial islands in the South China Sea to advance their desire for presence and possession of the South China Sea. Now, they haven't said that nobody can pass through there yet. Some of these islands are being militarized. Hangars are being built. The Chinese are claiming that this is for civilian purposes. They're building some lighthouses, and they have some naval guns. There have been some military traffic in there into some of these islands. There's a concern that the Chinese, as they build up their Navy and their Air Force with aircraft carriers and tanking capabilities, will try to assert control at some point over the South China Sea. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is another territorial dispute that China has. This is with Japan, which is an ally of the United States. China claims sovereignty over these islands, which is the Diaoyu Islands in Chinese and the Senkakus in Japanese. The Japanese have administered these islands for many, many years. The United States has said that that it falls under the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty, and that the United States will play a role in defending them if required, should China try to take possession of these islands. This is kind of an example of Chinese low-intensity coercion to assert control and presence. Instead of using naval ships, they're often using Coast Guard ships or maritime militia, so they don't break the threshold of showing that it's a military issue. They've claimed actually an ADIZ, an Air Defense Identification Zone, over these islands, which include over an area which includes these Japanese islands, had required, but it's really gotten to the point of asking aircraft that fly through this ADIZ to identify themselves with Chinese controllers. I'm not sure where commercial aircraft are in terms of doing that. Military aircraft, U.S. military aircraft, to my knowledge, are certainly not doing that. Next slide. This is part of China's influence, interesting influence. This is called the One Belt, One Road project. This is basically a rejuvenation of the Silk Road, the historic Silk Road that ran from Europe to China. This one also has a maritime component to it as well. This is a tremendous geopolitical, economic undertaking on the part of Beijing that may include as many as 68 countries. So you can see that all the way up into the Netherlands, all the way down to Indonesia in Southeast Asia. Both land and sea routes, and it's a tremendous undertaking, has lots of challenges to it. Some people are extremely concerned about it because it gives China an opportunity to increase its influence, not only regionally, but also globally across a good part of the world's landmass. China's also, you can see down there, Djibouti has built its first overseas base. It's a naval base. It's another effort on the part of China to increase its influence. This is unprecedented for the Chinese. We also have a base, obviously, at Djibouti. The Chinese say it's really only to support their deployed task forces that are operating in the Gulf of Aden on counter-terrorism / counter-piracy operations. There's possibilities, there's lots of talk and rumor that as part of this One Belt, One Road, that China may also develop naval bases other places, which is of concern to not only the United States, but other South Asian countries such as India. There's talk of a place of Gwadar, which is in Pakistan. There's a possibility of Myanmar or Burma, and also Sri Lanka. So the Chinese are starting to use their military and their influence to protect their interests globally. Let me just conclude real quickly in that I mean, people talk about a rising China. I don't think we're talking about a rising China. China's risen. I mean, of all the the superlatives and near superlatives that I've laid out for you, China is a major international power, and a great power. It's a major challenge not only in the future, but it's a major challenge to us now. And there are a number of, unfortunately, flashpoints. And certainly for the Army, the Korean Peninsula would be one of them. Unfortunately, I think between the United States and China, despite some cooperation on issues such as North Korea, there's increasing levels of strategic distrust, and there's a shifting balance of power, considering where China came from in terms of its military power. It's involved in this unprecedented military buildup, considering where it was 20, 25, 30 years ago when it started this. It's made tremendous gains. I think alternative scenarios are possible, but I think that a significant superpower competition between the United States and China is very likely in the years ahead. So I think I'll just stop there, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you again for the invitation, General and AUSA. What I'm going to talk about, okay, there we go, is really piggyback on Jeff's presentation and really talk about Russia, but probably also a little bit when I talk about the security, the operating environment, the current and the future operating environment, really put it in a broader context as well, but speak about Russia's malign influence and information operations. I'll talk about a couple of things. One is the broader influence campaign that Russia has waged. Then just a little bit about, specifically about the information operations, disinformation, and propaganda, of course. But then also speak about the vulnerabilities and sources of instability in the operating environment, and then finally conclude on what the toolbox that we have, or the toolkit rather, in engaging and managing the threat and dealing with Russia. And then in some of this toolkit, as you'll see, is really can really be applicable to other actors. So just to start off here is that, you know, I think since arguably there have been two touch points, if you will. Of course, the Ukraine conflict, and of course our U.S. election. And I think since that time, certainly since 2014, we, the United States, have been more sanitized, if you will, to disinformation, Russian disinformation and malign influence. And when we talk about the malign influence, I'm talking about broader beyond the media and the cyber domain. I'm really talking about economic, energy, security, cultural, and so forth. But arguably, we can look back to, you know, this has existed certainly since the Cold War with the active measures. And, you know, in the last decade, Russia has waged a pretty comprehensive influence campaign, particularly around Europe, in the, if you will, in its neighborhood. That, of course, we can look back to the 2008 Russia-Georgia war. Of course, I mentioned Ukraine, even the West, certainly the Germany case, the Lisa case, and can point to the Balkans. I'll talk about the Balkans in a second. But again, this is not new. So I think part of it is just a realization that we've been a little bit more sanitized to it. Next slide, please. Okay. So what is Russia trying to do? As I look into the broader influence campaign, there's really a couple of, if you will, you see here 5 key areas. But before it, you know, it's trying to mobilize and sustain support, domestic support. It also tries to communicate official positions. And I think that key, regardless of the method and the tool, it's really trying to put it in the context of what Russia is trying to do. So I would argue it's 2 key things. One is to discredit Western institutions and what Western institutions stand for, democracy, liberal order, and so forth. And then the other point that I'd make is where there are frictions in society, where there are internal divisions in society. Russia has tried to really play up those divisions, to play up this kind of narrative of us versus them. You're either with us or you're against us. But across the board, regardless of these 5 broad areas, when we talk about Russian influence operations more broadly, it's not uniform. It's not uniform across the country to country. It is not uniform across the population to population, or arguably even at the subnational level. So let me just kind of go through a few of them. I'm not going to go in detail, and I'm happy to answer questions. So in terms of, there's actually a government agency called Россотрудничество. It is kind of parallel to they do some science and technology, but it's also parallel to our U.S. Agency for National Development. It really tries to bring sort of a tie and cooperation, particularly between the ethnic Russian and Russian compatriot population abroad living outside of Russia. Of course, in many of the countries, when we talk about Russian influence campaigns, there's economic, energy, and corruption. But the key here is that some of these cooperations and some of these influences are pretty straightforward, and you can actually trace them, and some are not. Some are very not transparent and pretty opaque, and that makes it particularly difficult to track. Now, about culturally, there's of course the Russian Orthodox Church and what is called the Russian world, or Ruski Mir. It's really kind of from this concept that there is this broader Russian world outside of Russia. And particularly, this was put into the context since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there were more Russian compatriots residing outside of Russia than in Russia itself. So there's cultural activities, youth activities. Certainly the church is being utilized for influence operation. And then again, we see this, for example, in countries like Serbia and in Georgia. I'll just give you a couple of examples where I wouldn't argue that there is significant ethnic Russian populations in these countries, but the church and the Ruski Mir, or Russian world, are really used as key levers of influence. And then again, military cooperation and intelligence cooperation with certain countries, particularly in the European theater. Russia does have strong ties. Again, I'm thinking in this case of Serbia, for example. Again, I'll talk about the information operations domain in a second. But again, these are used very differently in different countries for different populations. It depends where there is perhaps inter-ethnic conflict. Or perhaps there are strong already pre-existing ties for cooperation. But again, the key is when we're dealing with, especially with the compatriot populations, with the ethnic Russians, if there are grievances to kind of attach yourself, then Russia will use those grievances. However, if those folks are actually assimilated into that host country, Russia uses that as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just a few select mediums of influence. Again, this is obviously not, we know this is not an exhaustive list. So just again, to just highlight a couple of points here. So here's our sort of, if you will, elements of the information operations campaign. But again, what is propaganda? What is disinformation? It is designed to sow distrust, confuse audience, and shape public opinion. So it is pretty difficult to tell whether something is true or false. There are filter bubbles that are created and alternative viewpoints, not just on social media that we've been hearing a lot about, but on news outlets. If there is not alternative contents, there's not alternative content, that content can be regurgitated, if you will. On social media, I think we've been hearing a lot about social media lately, particularly as it pertains to alleged involvement in the U.S. election. But again, looking back to Ukraine, looking back to the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, looking back to, for example, Macedonia, where there were some teenagers who were looking to make extra money right before our election. Looking back to the German case, the Lisa case, trolls are social media and trolls and troll armies, many of them that operate inside of Russia proper and also have affiliates in neighboring countries. It is part of a comprehensive campaign. So if you are actually putting out constant lies, disinformation, and propaganda, it becomes to some degree virtually impossible to counter that. And then, of course, the other layer to it, I'm talking about the information space here, we have to talk about cyber, right? And cyber, the hacking. That obviously, again, thinking to the Estonia case, the 2007 case, we're not just talking about the alleged sort of hacking into U.S. elections, but the Estonia case. There's been cyber attacks in Georgia, cyber attacks in Ukraine. Again, this is not new, but it's part of a comprehensive, I think this is a part of a comprehensive toolkit that Russia uses. Next slide. Okay, so this is actually from a product that we did looking at the Western Balkans. And the reason I put this up, it's really talking about the vulnerabilities and sources of instability in the operating environment. And so it's really looking from across the board, where you see one diamond is kind of less instability and three diamonds high instability across the Western Balkan countries. So why do I put that up there? I put that up there, and again, this is just one case, the Western Balkan case, but this can be probably replicated and should be examined across the board. The reason I put this up there for all of you is that I cannot underscore the importance to understanding and analyzing the current and future operating environment that our adversaries operate in. Why? Because adversaries like Russia, we can talk about Russia, we can talk about Iran, we can talk about ISIS, we can talk about Al-Qaeda, I mean, you name it, whether it's state or non-state actors. They exploit any vulnerabilities or sources of instabilities. Adversaries actually exploit those vulnerabilities to target the actual host nation or the populations that reside in this country, in those particular countries. So, and part of the issue that we're dealing with right now, the complex environment is so complex. It's not that we're just talking about land, air, sea, but we're also talking about cyber and media. So that's why it really presents this kind of a hybrid challenge. Now here, as you kind of go through all these sources of instability, Russia has used them to different means. Again, when I talked about Serbia, for example, there are strong partnerships and alliances between Russia and Serbia. Well, there's weakened institutions in Serbia. There's also weakened media environment. There's also the sense of, again, cultural and sort of national identity as well. But then if you look at Macedonia, and for this particular project, we traveled to Serbia and Macedonia last year. Russia plays up on the inter-ethnic conflict. How many of you remember roughly about a year ago, maybe a little less, when there was huge riots in Skopje, and basically Sputnik and RT was spinning these riots that they were basically for the Greater Albanian Project. Again, understanding this just becomes extremely, extremely important. And I think the reason is then once we know that what those vulnerabilities and sources of instabilities are, then I think we can actually put forth strategies and proactive tools to both counter and strengthen those vulnerabilities. Okay, next slide. So I'll end here, just a couple of things on some tools, if you will, in our collective toolbox for a comprehensive response. So speaking of the environment, I think it's important to talk about persistent engagement. And that is one area where I think on the United States, the US military has in some ways an advantage where we actually do want to proactively engage. I think in the new normal environment that is marked by hybrid threats and sources of instability, engagement, particularly engaging with the local populations, and not just mill-to-mill trainings, mill-to-mill exercises and trainings is extremely important. And that is really important when you're kind of dealing in this kind of phase 01 pre-conflict construct where engagement becomes extremely important. So let me just give you one example. Civil affairs teams. The preponderance of the civil affairs force is in the United States Army. And I think the civil affairs force, the Joint Civil Affairs Force, does a wonderful job in engaging and conducting persistent engagement and persistence engagement missions all over the world. I mean, I'm not just Europe, and not just talking about engaging or countering, depending on how you look at it with Russia. So things like face-to-face, these kind of engagements, engaging with the local populations is extremely important. On resilience, when we talk about countering and strengthening the environment and actually engaging or countering our adversaries and certain state and non-state actors, depending on how you want to look at it, creating that resilience is extraordinarily important. One of the things that I've heard in a lot of the work that I've conducted, particularly when I've actually gone in the region and gone to some of these countries, is that we have a problem with a lack of critical thinking. And this is not just a media literacy issue, which, by the way, interestingly enough, I was in Europe last week and I heard that media literacy issue has become a national security issue. But this, of course, starts at the educational level. This starts with how we conduct ourselves. And are we actually critically thinking about the information that we are processing? And in social media, how we're actually interacting with the local population. So critical thinking is extremely important. And of course, that is tied to the engagement piece, because again, resilience and building that resilience of society is kind of a key piece to it. Now, on the messaging, if you recall, I mentioned earlier that Russia's information and influence strategy is not uniform across the board. And I think it's very important when we think about messaging. For example, when we're talking about ethnic Russians or Russian compatriots, it's important to target to that audience. So know the audience that you're actually working with. Know the population centers that you're working with. And I think it's really important overall, holistically, is actually targeting that message and that narrative and that tactic towards the audience. And finally, I will mention, of course, none of this will exist without money. So going after corruption and criminal networks, I mean, these are very opaque. They're hard to define, if you will, but I think that's just going to be critically important for our overall engagement. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much. Now we do have time remaining for questions. I do have some that have been submitted, and I think we have additional questions that look like individuals have, so we will go around and collect that. But I will start by asking a question I have actually for Dr. Brooks. And you talk about China rising, or China's already risen. If I'm looking at a multi-domain threat, I look at China's capability. And you talked about that they've, and I know there's been reforms towards joint operations and towards expeditionary. I know they've got the capability to be expeditionary. When you look at joint operations, I'm interested in your assessment of how successful they will be in achieving a capability to conduct joint operations when, unlike the U.S., which is currently conducting joint operations in several conflict zones, and unlike Russia, which is operating in Syria, how China will be able, will they look for opportunities to engage, or will they focus on training, and what's your assessment of what kind of joint capability they will achieve in, say, 15, 20, 25 years?
What do you mean by engage in? Do you mean like somehow using force? Is that
Right,
what you
exactly.
mean? Okay,
Right,
I want to make
yes.
sure I understood that. The Chinese, you're right, they're in a training mode, certainly. I don't think they're looking for opportunities, quote unquote opportunities for getting involved in violent conflict to test out their capabilities. They're astute students of others. They're watching what the United States does and can do. They're studying you incredibly closely. In fact, I remember when I was a congressional staffer in the late 1990s, and the U.S. the origin of the most hits on the U.S. Army's doctrine website was China. The Chinese were pinging your website, reading all of your online documents more than any other users. They're still doing that. I mean, you'll see case studies today where they studied the Kosovo War and the use of air power. They're watching. Now, but there's a huge difference between practicing and doing. And that's why I made the point, and I hope I pushed it home, is that they're trying to be you. They know you're the U.S. military and U.S. Army is the finest in the world. And you've learned a lot over these last 15 years of persistent conflict. So they're trying to learn, whether it's through open source or through espionage, how you actually do your business. It's hard to say how China is going to evolve. I mean, I'm fond of the Danish physicist Niels Bohr's saying. He said that prediction is hard, especially about the future, and I think that's really the case. So it's difficult to say where China will be in a certain number of years in terms of their joint training, but I believe that they're committed to it. They're going to look to others to learn besides the United States, such as the Russians. And I think this is, they see this as the cutting edge of modern warfare, so I think they're definitely committed to it. Now, the question is whether they will ever have to put it in practice. We know the difference between practicing something and actually doing it for real, but they are definitely committed to the joint game.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Dr. Mankoff. What is the long-term prognosis for Russia beyond 2030? Will demographics, ethnic, and economic pressures prevent Russia from prospering in the long run?
Okay, nice simple question. Russia is not China. If China is a risen power, I would say Russia is a somewhat stagnant power. It's a power with a lot of capabilities, but with many of those capabilities kind of having plateaued. As far as the demographic issue goes, I think it's important to keep in mind that the demographic crisis that the country faced in the 1990s has largely played itself out. So while it's not experiencing a population boom, it actually has a comparatively stable population, one that's reinforced by very high rates of immigration, primarily from the former Soviet Union. And as in other countries with large rates of immigration, that does create some tensions. But those tensions have, for the most part, been managed so far, which is not to say that they will continue to be managed in the future. One of the concerns is a demographic shift with a much larger Muslim population over time, as many of the migrants from Central Asia and Azerbaijan are Muslim and tend to have larger numbers of children than the Slavic population. So managing those tensions over time is going to be a challenge, but I don't think it's right to speak of a demographic crisis. In terms of some of the other challenges that Russia faces, separatism was a problem, again, in the 90s, in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse, is much less so today. There's still something of a simmering insurgency in parts of the North Caucasus, which has various links to global jihadist movements, but again has largely been contained. It creates problems. Russia still suffers from occasional terrorist attacks and could have a larger problem once people who've gotten experience fighting in the Middle East, who traveled there from Russia or other post-Soviet republics, end up going back. And the security services of Russia, as well as its neighbors, are very attuned to the danger of those people flowing back. Economically, Russia is in a difficult place. Its economy is still very heavily oriented towards the production and sale of natural resources. And as we all know, natural resources and commodities of all types are subject to pretty extreme fluctuation in terms of their price. We're currently in an environment where oil prices are down significantly from where they were at the peak of the boom about a decade ago. On top of the effect of sanctions and just general political uncertainty, these lower commodity prices are putting a big hit on the Russian economy and are also constraining defense spending, which the government is committed to reducing, or at least to reducing the rate of growth. So this is also going to be a challenge. I think there's a pretty wide recognition that Russia would be more powerful. It would have a more dynamic economy if it could move away from this reliance on natural resource extraction. The problem is that there's now a political economic model in which control of natural resources and the revenues derived from them is the main source of economic and political patronage that keeps the existing political regime in power. And so any efforts to liberalize the economy, to move away from this natural resource-oriented system risks, at least in the short to medium term, political instability. And perhaps as with North Korea, although in a less extreme way, Russia has made the choice for political stability over economic growth and dynamism, and has been willing to sacrifice dynamism in order to maintain the existing political regime. Whether that will continue to be the case ahead to 2030, again, predicting is hard, especially the future, but I would say most likely, absent some kind of major discontinuity over the next 15 years, I think that's where Russia is likely to be. And given the somewhat limited economic base from which it's operating, in addition to the other challenges I mentioned, I think that means that we're not going to see Russia become a full peer competitor in the way that China is, but it's going to continue to be a large, powerful country that has a number of tools for projecting power and influence around its borders and more broadly, a country that is a well-developed and effective military force and that gets a lot of bang from its buck. And so Russia is going to continue to be a challenge, but I don't think that it's going to be a challenge quite of the same degree or type as China.
Thank you. A lot of questions, I think, due to the impact of Mr. Gauss's presentation on North Korea. There seems to be a lot of questions on North Korea. As he said, that seems to be the threat that's keeping people up at night. And a number of questions, and I'm just going to group several together. So, and related to China's influence in North Korea. So how much political influence do you believe China has within North Korea? I know you went over China's, their focus. How much intelligence presence do you believe China has within North Korea? And as a follow-up, not related to China, is there a scenario where economic sanctions against North Korea will ever work?
The best intelligence presence in North Korea is not China, it's Russia. I would say the near-term influence in North Korea right now is leaning toward Russia, not China. Russia is looking to integrate themselves just like they did in Syria. They're looking to get themselves, get a foot into Northeast Asia, and they're doing it through North Korea through the promise of possible economic goods to get to South Korea, which is the economic engine they're looking to get at. Long-term strategy, geography is going to trump everything, and obviously China is sitting there. But China right now has a lot of other issues on its table, which were elaborated on here today. But, if you were to look about trying to influence North Korea right now through a third party, I would say put your chips on Russia, not China. What was the other part, the economic?
Then economic sanctions.
No, sanctions won't work. So you can try. North Korea's already gamed this system. They've already brought in the oil they need for all of this. They played this out. You can try. Eventually, the sanctions will hurt. But there are three economies in North Korea. There's the people's economy, there's the military economy, and there's the royal economy, which funds the Kim family. The people's economy is suffering. All those gas lines of, people trying to get gas, the people that are suffering, the Korean people. Are they going to rise up? No, they're not going to rise up. I know we would like to think that they're going to rise up and overthrow the regime. It's not going to happen. This is not the Arab world. This is North Korea. But there is a way. There is a way to get North Korea possibly to stop what they're doing. And it doesn't come from pressure. It comes from engagement. But we may have already passed the threshold where it's too late. It really depends on how close they are to the nuclear program. If they're close to the nuclear program, they will not engage on a freeze. If they're further out, and if you promise them you're not giving up your nuclear program, but you're freezing it, there's no intrusive inspections, all you have to do is stop the testing, and we're going to give you economic incentives and security guarantees, they might go for that. It's going to be a very bitter pill for us to swallow because it's rewarding bad behavior. But I think we're so far down the rabbit hole with North Korea right now, we have to start thinking out of the box, and just lobbing more sanctions on this country and congratulating ourselves and patting ourselves on the back is not going to solve the problem. And the thing is going to get worse. And eventually, if we don't do some sort of military action, we're going to be facing a country that has a nuclear program that can hit the United States. And then we're in an issue of containment. And that becomes a much more complicated situation than we're at right now. So that's what concerns me.
Okay. I think, Dr. Mankoff, you would like to.
I was just on the Russian influence in North Korea. I would say it's actually not all that substantial. Russian knowledge of North Korea may be reasonably good. They do have plenty of people there, both overt and otherwise. But at the same time, in terms of actual leverage, there's not a major economic or military relationship. If you're talking about who can put major pressure on the North Korean economy, that's much more China than Russia. North Korea has some workers who are living and working in Russia and sending their earnings back to the regime. That is one source of leverage, but it's a comparatively limited one. I think more important is the fact that Russia sees North Korea as not being its problem. I don't think it's willing to step away from China on this issue, much as it expects China to follow its lead on issues in its own sort of perceived sphere of influence. I think it's willing to leave this, to follow China's lead on this one. The idea of extending connectivity through North Korea to South Korea is something that Russians have talked about for a long, long time, whether that's going to be a gas pipeline or a railway, something like that. If and when the political environment is conducive to that, I think the Russians will jump at the opportunity, but we've got a long way to go, and I don't think the Russians believe that the opportunity to do that is something that they can count on anytime soon.
Right. Thank you. We did actually have a request, if they could bring the North Korea escalation graph back up. People are interested in seeing that again. So that was Ken Gauze's presentation on North Korea, and there was an escalation graph. This is an interesting question because we're talking, the panel's talking about multi-domain threats. So I'm going to ask all of the panel to contribute. Describe the nature of the future Russia-China relationship, particularly if each gets the power that it's seeking. And several follow-ons, how would you see, from your perspective as policy experts, Russia's view on assessment of China and China's assessment of Russia as a partner or competitor? I'm going to let anyone that would like to.
I can say something. I think Russia, Beijing, and Moscow see it as a relationship of necessity more than a relationship of love. There's a tremendous amount of strategic distrust between the two capitals. The Russians certainly don't want to be considered to be the little brother to China, but they see what's happening across the border. They understand the number of Chinese that have influence in the Russian Far East. They're aware of the history between the two countries. I think they're using each other to play off the United States. The Chinese like to do naval exercises in the South China Sea with the Russians. Gives the Russians an opportunity to, show their power projection. Their Navy's not in such great shape, certainly not of the time of the Cold War, especially in the Far East when it had its largest fleet was actually in the Far East. The Chinese like to send a signal that maybe the Russians would side with us over Taiwan, issue of Taiwan. So I think there's a lot of strategic mistrust. They're using each other to advance their interests vis-a-vis the United States, making us think that this strategic partnership that they have will lead to something. My view is that, for instance, if the United States were to get into a dust-up with China over North Korea, that the Russians would probably say, "Let us hold your coats while you guys duke it out." So I think there's not a lot of love. The Russians have been forced into some parts of this relationship they haven't liked. They had production licenses on the Su-27 fighter. The Chinese were stealing it like crazy. The Russians cut it off, and now the Russians are back because they need the money. So it's a very complicated relationship, and as you know from the history of it, there's a lot of concerns. I think it may be stronger or more accepting at the political level than at the military level. So if you're a Russian general, when you look across at China, what do you see? It's not happy. So I think that's kind of where it's at. Greg probably has some, or Jeffrey, I'm sorry, has some thoughts on that.
Sure. Okay, let me just talk a little bit about Russia. I would agree that there's not a lot of love or trust in the relationship, despite the declarations that come out of the fairly frequent summits between Putin and Xi. The characterization of the relationship officially has escalated over the last decade. It's now something like a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination, I think is the official term they use. So it's sort of like, yeah, it's like if it's the People's Democratic Republic of whatever, it's even less democratic than if it's just the Democratic Republic. So I think the more adjectives you throw in, the less substance there is to it. I would say, though, that one of the key things that is pushing these two countries together is a shared antipathy to the current state of the global order. They want to change it in different ways, but they both want to change it. They both see the predominant role of the United States in their respective regions and in global institutions as being a constraint on their abilities to achieve their strategic interests. And so to the extent that they're focused on these global level issues and on pushing back against the United States, they have a lot of interests in common. They also have shared economic interests. China is Russia's most, after the European Union, is Russia's most important economic partner, has been a key prop for the Russian economy since the imposition of sanctions, has kept some Russian projects alive that haven't been able to get Western funding since the sanctions have been imposed. There's mistrust at the military level. I think there's also regional tensions. These are primarily evident in Central Asia, the kind of interior Eurasia that is the focal point for the Belt and Road, but also for Russia's own efforts to maintain a kind of sphere of influence. To a significant degree, they've been able to manage those tensions, but you can see them kind of in the background. And I think when and if a point comes when they're no longer both focused on their global level tensions with the United States, or when one of them is trying to improve relations with the United States, then you're going to see more friction emerge over some of these areas in their shared geography and over the issues that Peter was talking about.
Great. This is a question for Virazak. How well does you talked about the chart with the Russian with the nature of the different Western Balkan countries and how Russia could target those messages. The question is, how do you view the effectiveness? How well does the Russian message resonate with those in those Western Balkan and other Eastern European countries with large Russian diaspora? So what's your assessment of the long-term effectiveness of the Russian efforts?
I think it depends on the effectiveness and the impact. If they have been engaged in staging influence and information operations in a particular country for a long time, and they have made inroads, whether public or not, arguably speaking, their effectiveness is going to be far greater. I think the other way to measure effectiveness is when we look at our collective action. How effective, broadly speaking, has what we have been doing to both strengthen institutions in these countries, whether we're talking about the Balkans or Eastern Europe or other parts in the neighborhood, if you will. How effective as our response has been. And again, I think part of it has to be put in the context of what are these vulnerabilities and sources of instabilities in these societies, whether we're talking about corruption or, for example, here's an example on the effectiveness. Historical narratives. Historical narratives exist virtually not all over Europe or the former Soviet Union space, but in many parts of it. So, for example, when you look at Latvia or Estonia, where those countries are somewhat divided in that they have pretty significant percentage of ethnic Russian populations, and they play up to those historical narratives. In some ways, Russia does not have to do much in terms of just putting out disinformation, because those, if you will, memories of the Cold War, what they see on television, what the kind of content and news that they get from Russia, I mean, it's it's natural. And then you have to look at the demographics. Certainly, the older population that has grown up with that environment, they I think are going to be more susceptible to influence. Particularly, how do the messages spread? First of all, television, that's primary source of information, and then there's also friends and family, and that's where the trust factor comes in. The younger population, perhaps they're more worldly, they get information from social media, from the internet, from others, they may have other alternative sources of content. Not to say that they're going to be less susceptible to influence, but they have other modes of influence to get. So again, the effectiveness, I think, is just going to be it's going to depend. And then the last point I'll make on the effectiveness is a lot of the things that we don't know. We talk about disinformation, information operations, but what about sort of ties via energy, via economic security? What about those ties via intelligence? Again, some of them are just not transparent, and they're pretty opaque. So, and they keep on working for a long time. So if you think of effectiveness from that perspective, I would say there's, to a degree, they have been effective.
Okay, back to China for Dr. Brooks. A more tactical or shorter term issue and a broader issue. One is your views on China's approach in the South China Sea. I know you talked about it has been less than, they're building islands that have runways. Is that a long-term scheme that they're focused on in the South China Sea? And then in a longer sense, I have several questions related to Chinese political system survival. How do they balance being a global economic power with the continued authoritarian control? And is Xi Jinping likely to try to remain as a leader past 10 years? Or so will it be a peaceful transition, or will there be, what do you see in his future as well? But again, the balance, how does China balance that can they be a economic power without having some sort of, maintaining that strong one-party political control?
I think they're balancing it very well. The fact is that they're quite successful, obviously, at the international level economically. In fact, there are many countries that are trying to, which I think is counterproductive to Western efforts, but there are many countries that are trying to emulate the Chinese model, and including in places like Africa, where there have been a tremendous amount of effort to increase democratization and liberalization of economies and decrease corruption. They say, well, why can't we be like China? Why can't I be a strong man and rich too? So I don't think there's a problem. And the Chinese consider, if you talk to them, they'll say, this is just business. It's nothing to do with politics, it's business. And this is a problem, the challenges that the West has with the Chinese foreign policy in places where we're competing, which is globally, basically. The Chinese don't put conditions under aid. The United States and the West does. You have to do this, this, and this if you want to get this aid. Chinese say, here's some aid. We'll build you a stadium, we'll build you roads. There's problems with that too, such as the transfer of skills. The Chinese come into a country that needs infrastructure or railroads or bridges or roads. They'll build bridges and roads for them for political influence and perhaps access to commodities, depending on what country X or Y has. But they'll also bring Chinese labor to do it. For instance, an African once said to me that China was their greatest dream and their greatest nightmare, both at the same time. Because they can be helpful, but sometimes they keep strong men in power, they undermine democracy, and they also, when they bring people in, instead of transferring skills, teaching people how to build roads and bridges and trains or railways, they bring Chinese labor in to do it. So there's no transfer of skills. So I don't think the Chinese have a problem with that, and they will tell you it's just business. It's business. It has nothing to do with politics. South China Sea. I think there's actually 3 questions there. President Xi, I don't sense that he will change the Constitution, but I don't know. He will spend another 5 years. I think he'll be thinking about legacy issues over the next 5 years. I think there was a sense on his part that previous leaders just didn't do enough, quickly enough, for China, that they were lackadaisical about advancing Chinese interests, and he's been very, very assertive. And that includes what he's doing in the South China Sea. Think about this. You know, making the South China Sea, claiming the South China Sea as a Chinese lake, essentially. This is huge. And they've done it through a process of what some folks call salami slicing, you know, very thin slices of salami, one piece at a time. Kind of like, I think, what the Russians did in Ukraine. You know, they did this, and nobody reacted. They did this, nobody reacted, and they kept pushing. You know, it's the Leninist philosophy, you know, if you're feeling mush, keep pushing, right? If you hit metal, you stop. And I think this is what China's doing in the South China Sea. You know, people build artificial islands. I mean, look at Singapore, right? I mean, you know, this place has doubled or tripled in size. But this is different. This is not Singapore. The Chinese have been doing this a little bit of time. They built one artificial island. And they didn't do it overnight. They did it rather quickly when they decided they were going to put their mind to it. But it happened. They're asserting themselves, and now they have presence. They actually were trying to. I think on some of these islands, the international courts have ruled that they do get a 12 nautical mile territorial waters around it, but they're not eligible for exclusive economic zones. I think if you look at a lot of these islands, if you put these 200-mile exclusive economic zones under the law of the sea treaty, China would have economic rights in a good portion of that 9-dash line. I think they will continue to militarize it. Because at some point they may want to assert control. And I think a lot of it has to do not only with the possibility of what lies beneath the seabed in the South China Sea in terms of energy. I mean, China's a major importer of energy. They need that to keep the wheels of industry turning. They need that to continue for the Chinese Communist Party to have political legitimacy by making the Chinese people, improving their standard of living and making the Chinese people proud of China. I don't know if anybody went and saw the 2008 Olympics in China and what they did there. I mean, the infrastructure and everything else. I mean, this is important. This is critically important for China. But they're also, you know, at some point strategically, I mean, I think there's definitely a rivalry today between Japan and China, and it's increasingly so. And a lot of the energy, Northeast Asia got the short stick on energy when they were passing out energy when the world was created. Japan imports, what, 80%, I think, of its oil. South Korea is similar. Taiwan similar to that. China could have put a stranglehold on some of these countries if they wanted to by cutting off the flow of goods and energy through the South China Sea. And having those islands there, and I'm not saying those islands cannot be dealt with militarily, but having those islands there certainly increases the possibility of them doing it at least in the short term. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have time for all right, well, I'll have one more question and then maybe any final thoughts. So I appreciate that. Also, I just wanted to share with everyone that the slides that were shown will be posted on the AUSA website. So you will be able to see those. So again, this is looking long term, and we've had a number of questions from our audience focus. So we had a good description from Mr. Gauss, from Ken, on what would happen if Kim Jong-un is not in power. For China, you assess that Xi Jinping will not change the constitution, and there would be another another Communist Party leader. This question is for you, Dr. Mankoff. Post-Putin, what is the future in Russia post-Putin? So we had post-Kim Jong-un, post-Xi. What is post-Putin?
Right. Well, the first question, I suppose, is when is post-Putin?
Yeah.
There is an election scheduled in Russia next spring. Putin has not formally announced that he's running again. The general assumption is that he will make that announcement soon, but he hasn't. And even if he does, he has a 6-year term. They could change the Constitution again to allow him to stay in power. He'll be in his mid-70s by that point. It's a reasonable question. It's reasonable to start thinking about what a post-Putin Russia would look like, whether it comes sooner or later. I think there have been efforts to answer this question already. The so-called castling maneuver, where they transferred power to Dmitry Medvedev in 2008, was, I think, one attempt at this. One that, for a variety of reasons, didn't work the way that various members in the Russian elite wanted it to work, and so Putin came back. Putin's most important role in Russia is as the arbiter. There are competing factions, competing clans, competing economic interests, and he's the one who arbitrates among those disputes. Anybody who succeeds him is going to have the buy-in of a majority, if not a substantial number, of those same actors. So whether the post-Putin leader is somebody from the security services like him, somebody from the military, is a civilian, whatever it is, that's going to be the biggest challenge that they're going to have to navigate. I don't think that you're going to have somebody come in from outside the system, Alexei Navalny, for example, who is considered now to be the leading opponent of Putin and who is trying to run against him in April, but the state is doing what it can to prevent that from happening. I think there are those within the system who could tolerate somebody like Navalny, and there's some degree of coordination between them and him. But at the end of the day, I would imagine that whoever ends up on top, once Putin is no longer there, is going to be somebody from within the system, which is the model that we've seen in a couple of post-Soviet countries that have gone through political transitions recently. Uzbekistan, just within the last year or so, did this. So, absent some kind of major crisis, I think that's probably what we'll see. I don't think we're going to see a fundamental liberalization or softening or whole-scale political change in Russia. There is some pressure from below, and it's going to be a challenge for them to manage that. But I also think that there's enough acceptance and even active support for the status quo that we're not looking at a sort of 1991 style scenario.
Thank you very much. Again, I want to, on behalf of the Army Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence G2 office and team, I want to thank each of our panelists again for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and share insights that I think were very valuable in looking at current and future threats that the United States may face. I want to thank the audience for coming and participating, and I want to thank you for the questions that you have submitted. I think they were really relevant, and I think this was very rewarding for all the members of our audience.